Welcome to Garage Gym Athlete Cool Downs. These episodes are short, actionable podcasts pulled from previous interviews and content we've been publishing for the last several years. So go for a walk, hop on the rower, or clip into the bike for this cool down episode. So tell me a little bit more about your programs. You said you're currently working on a few new books. Is that right?
Yeah. So I wrote the Muscle and Strength Pyramids with my co-authors Andrea Valdez and Andy Morgan back in late 2015, and those are actually based on two YouTube series I did. One that was 2012, 2013 on nutrition, and the one that I made in 2015. And these are basically, they're pyramids because it's a hierarchy. So the idea is that we get so much information about training and nutrition, we have a really difficult time prioritizing it. And we're told the timing of when we eat, how much we eat, the quality of what we eat, how much protein we're getting, all these things. And they're each one of them are in these clickbaity title articles that make them sound like the most important thing at the time you read them. But everything can't be maximally important all the time. And maybe the amount of protein you eat in a day is slightly more important than whether or not you had 30 grams at a certain time. And that it's basically just a science-driven guide to providing priorities and then setting up your nutrition through the order of priorities, starting with big things like energy balance, moving on to macronutrients and then micronutrients and then timing. And then finally, if you even really want to, considering supplementation, and then thinking about the overarching theme of behavior and lifestyle. And then similar with training, that video series was all around understanding adherence, volume, intensity, and frequency, and then progression, exercise selection, and then things like tempo and rest periods, and then incorporating that all into a bigger understanding of periodization. So those two video series, I got approached by both Andy and Andrea saying, hey, we should make these into ebooks. And then I said, hey, let's combine forces here. And the three of us got together and put those out in 2015. They did really well. We were very, very pleased. They got such penetration. And now we're really excited to be releasing about 3 years later the second edition. So, yeah. That's
awesome. And I would love to hear your thoughts, going back to nutrition, bodybuilding. What are your thoughts? You mentioned early on in the podcast of ketogenic diets and nutrition for bodybuilding versus, more standard approach. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the big picture concepts one needs to understand for nutrition are that energy balance is really going to dictate whether you're going to lose mass. Not that you can't lose fat and gain muscle at the same time, but especially when I'm talking to bodybuilders, they're at a point where they're probably not so high in body fat that they can do that. And they've also reached such a high level of development already that they really want to stack the chips in their favor when they are trying to gain muscle. So it probably makes sense to leverage being in a slight surplus or an appropriate deficit for either phases of gaining or cutting. And then beyond that, if we look at all the data out there and all the various types of people who've gotten success in bodybuilding, we see that the one commonality is a relatively high protein diet. I would say the research would suggest at least 0.7 grams per pound, which is about 1.6 grams per kg. And after that, you get a lot of flexibility. So there are people who do just fine with ketogenic approaches. There are people who do very poorly with them and do much better with higher carbohydrate diets. I think very low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, on average, are probably not appropriate for most bodybuilders. If we look at the spectrum of research, we see that performance is often maintained if we're talking about lifting, which makes sense. It's not a whole lot of energy expenditure. It's not like trying to run a marathon. Mm-hmm. Guys are popping goo in the middle of the race and stuff like that. So it's low total energy expenditure. It's glycogen dependent, which is we're starting to understand not just totally depleted if you go keto. It's maintained to a reasonable degree. And bodybuilding training and powerlifting training is not that glycogen depleting in the first place. And it certainly seems to help, at least for an initial period, with reducing hunger a little bit. There seems to be an independent effect of being on a higher protein than just your protein going up, which often happens on a ketogenic diet. So sometimes people will just spontaneously get leaner because they're eating less. But it's also not great for muscle gain. There's been a consistent finding in the research that people either kind of have a halt to muscle gain when they go even on ad libitum, like eat as much as you want ketogenic diets, or they actually see muscle loss or lean mass losses. And we don't have great studies on discerning what the reasons for that are, but there are some potential mechanistic reasons. But I think overall, it's probably a good idea to have an appropriate amount of carbohydrates given you're an anaerobic strength-based athlete. So I typically say, hey, don't go below 1 gram per kg, half a gram per pound. And especially if you're trying to put on muscle mass, you're going to need to leverage some carbohydrates most likely. So but beyond that, you get a lot of flexibility. And there's some other things you should think about, like distributing protein evenly across your meals for the day, probably having some protein around training, and then, making sure that you have a good mix of single item ingredient foods that are largely micronutrient dense, fruits, vegetables, but then also don't be so restricted that that can cause issues with your relationship with food. So, still feel like you have your adult card. And if you want to have some candy or something, do it every once in a while. No big deal.
Now, going back to energy balance, I think it's very important, especially depending on your goals, different phases you might want to roll in and out of. But can we talk about maybe how to get the most accurate measure of energy balance for an individual? How you would go about it?
That's a good question. And I think it comes down to, there's this push and pull of accuracy versus, I might even say sanity. So when you have goals similar to a bodybuilder, like let's say you want to ensure that you're in a surplus, you're actually gaining weight at some rate to make sure that you're actually putting on muscle, or conversely, a much more extreme goal, you are trying to maintain as much muscle mass as possible while getting down to only essential levels of body fat to get on stage. You're going to starve yourself for 6 months to look your best and somehow manage to lift weights during that period. That's when you have to leverage more accuracy. Because if you were to just kind of adopt quote unquote healthy habits and do what a lot of trainers might recommend to the everyday client, which I think is great, about educating them with nutrition, et cetera, you probably would maintain a athletic physique. But if you tried to push further, you would get pushed back and you would be intensely hungry, lethargic, and you would experience, relative energy deficiency syndrome. You would have all of the things that us bodybuilders get to experience on the way down to being shredded. And the only way to overcome that is to ignore your hunger signals and work around them and force yourself to get into the condition you need to be competitive. So that's when it requires you to be incredibly precise and accurate. So only in the case where you truly do need to be tracking your nutrition and weighing your body and all that stuff, because there is a cost to that. Ignoring your hunger signals is typically not a good idea. That's when you probably want to take a few weeks, get on the scale on a regular basis, at least 3 times per week, get an average, weigh in when you're after you use the toilet, before you eat or drink anything, first thing in the morning, get an average, and look at your average change in body weight over a couple weeks, and then also track your nutrition using a food scale when possible, estimating as best you can when you eat out. And if you're a bodybuilder, that's probably not too frequent. And then chucking that on the food scale, chucking it into something like MyFitnessPal or some other tracking account, and then looking at the relationship between the two. So if your body weight has gone down over that 2-week period, you're in a deficit. If it's gone up, you're in a surplus. And then you can start making adjustments to put yourself into an appropriate energy intake for your goals. And the goal should be probably to lose between about 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week on average. You might track that over 2 to 3 weeks when you're trying to maintain muscle mass while losing body fat. And consequently, when you're trying to put on muscle mass, it's like that amount, but per month, at least if you're a natural lifter, where once you've decided I'm a competitive bodybuilder, you probably have a fair amount of your genetic potential's muscle mass on you. There's more to gain, of course. There's a difference between, world champion bodybuilder and a amateur bodybuilder, but you can't expect to be putting on muscle mass really quickly without just putting on a lot of body fat. So that process is kind of like watching paint dry for a natural lifter.
And what about if you want to gain some muscle mass, but that's the main goal, but you also want some athletic performance? Like maybe you needed to gain some weight for sport, something like that. What would you recommend someone do?
Yeah, I think that's where you start to really have to think about balancing the weight room activities with what you're doing for your sports specific training. And then instead of the mindset that a bodybuilder would have of what's the most volume I could pump through the system while still recovering, which is a very common perspective. Like I need to do either the highest intensity to failure or the most volume, maybe short of failure. It's kind of two different paradigms, and they both seem to work. But regardless, there's a very high training stress level if we're going to talk about the aggregate combination of volume and intensity. And then what's the best way to organize that? How do I recover? And then I'm going to push that to the nth degree. That's the bodybuilding mindset. And that would optimize hypertrophy. However, training like that, when you also have to, pitch a game or have a contact sport, or you have to be fresh and ready to move laterally, all these things, you probably don't want to be pulling heavy deadlifts on a Friday and then playing a game on Saturday. That just doesn't make any sense. So you probably need to look at what is the most number of days that you can do without interfering with your sport-specific training that will still reach the requirements of improving muscle size. So that typically looks more like 2 to 3 days per week tops of progressive resistance training, a mixture of different repetition ranges, and then sticking to movements that are both effective and give you a good bang for their buck, so compound movements, but that are also low risk. So heavy deadlifting off the floor for your average athlete who tends to be, if they're a male, like 6'3" or taller, probably not something I would choose. I'd probably think there's something better like a hex bar deadlift or maybe an RDL or something else. You also have to think about logistics. Like if you talk to a weightlifter, he'll tell you, hey, we've got to do snatch, clean and jerk and all this stuff. And I go, that takes a while to teach someone to do properly. Mm-hmm. You can just have them jump on a box or do kettlebell swings or something like that, or explode a medicine ball into the air. There's a lot of ways to train triple extension without having to do an Olympic snatch. So you have to think about basically that the time cost of investment in teaching them the movements, the risk of injury, and then how much time can they realistically spend on this, and then construct a program around those constraints versus thinking like a bodybuilder, what's the optimal way to grow as much muscle as possible. And what we fortunately know is that there's a big effect of diminishing returns when it comes to number of sets performed and number of days trained and total volume. We definitely know that doing, say, 10 sets per week is better than doing, say, 5 to 9 sets per week, which is better than doing, say, 1 to 4. However, more than 50% of the gains come in that first category of doing 1 to 4 sets per week on a muscle group. So if we're looking at it from a time efficiency perspective, like you don't need to be doing 10 plus sets per week. You can get somewhere in the range of 6 to 8, and you're getting 80% of the gains you might get if you push the volume up to those bodybuilder levels. And that's a proposition that a bodybuilder would never let happen. Like, yeah, I want to get those extra 20% of my gains, and I will do twice the amount of work to get it. I don't care. That's I'm a bodybuilder. But it's probably a bad idea to have, a baseball player doubling their pressing volume just to get more delts and triceps and chest for their sport. Or any example you can think of to where someone has to double the stress to get an increase of 20% in gains when they've actually got to play and potentially smash into someone else.
Thanks for listening to today's Cool Down. If for some ridiculous reason you are not subscribed to Garage Gym Athlete programming, fix that problem right now. Go to garagegymathlete.com, sign up for a free trial, get started with us today. Thanks for listening.